Hey guys, in this part we're going to set up some lights for our scene, and then once we have the lights set up we're going to continue with the texturing. Now when it comes to lighting, there are many different ways of doing it. You have your traditional lights, which come in many forms like omni lights, spotlights, infinite area lights, and so on. And then on the other hand you have GI, which is global illumination. Now for this particular series here on this minigun, I am not going to be using GI for several reasons. First of all, it takes longer to render. Sometimes, depending on your settings, you may get some flickering with animations. Now, Maxon has done a really good job of updating the advanced render module that comes with Cinema 4D, and it is now almost entirely flicker free, which means that you can use it now with animation, and you no longer get the flickering that was associated with it in previous versions of Cinema 4D. But even then, I still find myself using traditional lights more than global illumination. I always like the challenge of trying to find the way to fake GI using standard lights. So what we're going to be using for this is regular lights, but we're going to be creating a light dome. So that's the type of rig that we're going to be using for this. And for those of you that don't know what a light dome is, first of all, we need to create the dome. And in this case, we're going to choose a sphere and change the type to hemisphere. And then we're going to set the radius to 15,000. Now, a light dome is basically a large dome like we have here, and each point on this dome will contain a light. And all of those lights will be focused inward on the scene to give it a nice, even, diffused, lit look. So the dome is there, and now we need to create the light that we want to use. And for this, I like to use spotlights. So we need to click on the light, and the shadow, we need to change it to soft. And we don't need any specular, because usually specular is associated with a direct light, and a direct light would be a main source of light, perhaps the sun or one of the brighter lights that you have in the scene. But seeing as how we just want an overall diffused look with no direct lighting, then we need to turn off specular. And we need to take the intensity down as well, so I'm going to take it to about 12. So we'll go to the Details tab, and we need to take and disable the Use Inner. And for the outer angle, we may need to come back and make some adjustments, so for right now we're just going to leave that setting alone. So we'll go to the Shadow tab, and of course we've got some more settings here for the shadow map and the radius, sample radius, and for the bias. But for right now we just want to leave these at the default settings, because if we start changing them, well, we haven't even got this rig completely set up yet. So I want to make some preview renders once this is set up to determine whether or not we need to change any of these attributes here for the shadow. So we need to click on the light, and we need to alt-click a cloner object, and we need to go to the cloner object, and we need to change the mode to object, and for the object here we need to choose sphere, and we'll place our large sphere in there. So now we'll back out, and I'm just going to hide the sphere from the render and the viewport, and now you can see what our light dome looks like. But that is way too many lights. So in order to reduce the number of lights, we can click on the sphere and just reduce the number of segments. And you can see the lower you go with the segments, the fewer lights you will have. Okay, so that may be enough lights for us. I don't know, that may be too much, but we'll just leave it at a segments value of 11. So if we hit render, nothing at all. And the reason for that is because these lights, they're all focused outward. That means the lights are not being directed inward, and there is no lighting that is affecting the inside of this dome. So what we need to do is tell these lights to be pointed inward. So to do that, since the light is a child of the cloner object, we can use one of the effectors to position these lights or turn them around. So we'll click on the cloner object and go to MoGraph, Target Effector. Now we're using the Target Effector to target the lights. So wherever this Target Effector moves, you can see the lights will follow it. So I'm just going to move this just to position that Target Effector underneath the gun just to center things up. And now we'll make a preview render. Okay, so we've got some ugly looking stuff going on over here on the edge of the cube for the floor. And that's because in a previous part of this series I took that cube and made it larger. And not only that, but the angle of the light is only set at 30 degrees. So if we were to take this up to maybe 50 degrees, now that light has a wider angle to cast the light from. So now we are covering a wider range of an area here with all of those spotlights on the dome. But you'll notice that when we took the angle up, we lost a lot of shadowing here on the gun, such as the bottom portion of the stand where these little sockets are, where the legs are going to go into. It looks like we've got the auto light on and we don't have any dark shading there at all to give a sense of depth. So if we were to take the light and let's go play with the shadow, let's take the shadow map up to 500 by 500. Okay, so things are getting a little darker. Let's go up to 1000 by 1000. Okay, so now you can see we are getting some shading in there now. That looks pretty good. But as a result of that, we're also getting a lot of these unwanted shadows here on the cube that we're using for the floor, and I would rather get rid of those. So there's a couple of ways in order to remove those shadows. We could continue to play around with the sample radius and the bias settings here for our shadow maps, and we could make some adjustments, but it's going to take a lot of fine tuning because the more spread out and diffuse these shadows are to eliminate them, the less shading we're going to be getting here on our stand and for the gun, and it's going to start looking more and more fake like it was when we first set the light up. So one way that we could fix this that doesn't involve messing around with our shadows is to click on the cube, which is the floor object, and we want to give it a compositing tag. And what we'll do here is we'll disable cast shadow and receive shadows. Now when we render, now we no longer have any shadowing at all. And you're probably thinking, well, why in the world did you do that? Well, the reason is because instead of allowing the shadow from the light to cast the shadow to give the appearance that this gun really isn't floating in midair, we're going to use ambient occlusion locally on the ground plane here, and that's going to give us some diffuse shading around the legs in order to give the appearance that this gun is actually on the ground. So the next thing we want to do is take the option here and enable it called compositing background. And what that's going to do is, you'll notice here, I'm not sure if you can see this, but, and I'll just grab the doodle tool so I can highlight it. And I'll grab a red color. If you notice here, there is a line that runs right along here where this plane is, or where this cube is, and where it meets the sky object behind it. And you'll notice there is a faint line that runs across there. It's really hard to see because the shade of gray between the floor, or between the cube acting as the floor, and the sky, they're very similar in shades of gray, but there is a very faint line there, and I'll just render this again so you can see it. And it goes across here, and if we enable the option compositing background, what that's going to do is it's going to completely eliminate that line. Okay, so we've got our lighting set up the way we want it, and now what we want to do is set up some ambient occlusion for the floor. And we'll probably want to set it up for the gun as well, but there's a couple things that I would like to go over. So the first thing to do when you want to set up ambient occlusion, at least from what I've seen with most people, is that they automatically go to the render settings and they go to Effect, Ambient Occlusion, and then they render, and now they've got ambient occlusion. Well, the problem with this is that whenever you use ambient occlusion from the render settings here, this is a global effect, which means ambient occlusion is going to be applied globally, which means everything in the scene is going to be affected by ambient occlusion. So the only way to keep certain objects from being seen by it is to give them a compositing tag, and then down here in the tag attributes you need to disable seen by AO, and then that particular object will not be seen by ambient occlusion. However, in this part I'm not going to use it globally, so I'm just going to take it and delete it. What I'm going to do is use it locally, and when I say locally, I'm specifically talking about applying it to a shader, and in that way you can take that shader or material and apply it to certain objects and control where you want that ambient occlusion to be. So let's create a new material, and I'm going to call this floor AO, and I'm going to disable the specular channel, and I'm going to go into the diffusion channel, and I'm going to click here on the little drop down menu, and I'm going to go to Effects, Ambient Occlusion. And then I'm going to take this floor AO and apply it to the cube object. And now when we render, now the only place the ambient occlusion is being applied to is the floor object, or in this case the cube, which really I should rename it to floor. Now there's a couple of other areas on the gun that I see that look like they're going to need some ambient occlusion as well, such as right in this area here you can see there's some unwanted light. It almost looks like there's light coming from the bottom of this that's kind of passing through the polygon, and that's just because of what we've been using the light here, the spotlight with the settings, but there's an easy way to fix that, and that's just to add ambient occlusion, and that will fill in that little gap there. Because right now it kind of looks like it's sort of floating, that side bracket. But with some ambient occlusion applied to that, we can fix that. Okay, so we've got the ambient occlusion set up for the floor, which is what we want to do. And what I would also like to do is get a little diffused shading underneath the stand here. So I'm just going to take the leg object here, and in a previous part of this tutorial I said that I was going to texture the leg and then control click and drag to copy it, and then you can just take those copies and rotate them around until you have your 4 legs. Well, there's actually a better way of doing this, so we're going to be using an instance for this. And here's how the instant works. So you click on your leg object, and we'll go up here to our drop down menu where the bool and symmetry and everything here can be found, and we want to click on instance. And now here we have our leg instance. So I'm just going to drag that down to be next to our main leg. And now we can take that leg instance and rotate it 90 degrees in a heading value. We'll control click and drag to duplicate it, and we'll rotate it another 90 degrees, and then we'll control click it again and do one more up to 270. Now when we render, we have 3 instances of that first leg, and the best part is that all you have to do is modify and make updates to the main leg object, regardless if it's a material or if you're working with the geometry, and those other 3 legs will automatically update themselves. So for example, if we were to click on the sweep nerve here, and to see this a little better, I'm going to hide the cloner object here from the viewport. That way we can see things a little better. And if we go into the sweep nerve for the main leg object and we click on this spline, go into point mode, and you don't have to do this, you can just watch, and we take some splines here, the points from the spline, and we move them up, you can see that the other 3 instances are updating themselves to copy the original leg. So all we have to do is modify this main first leg, and the other 3 will automatically update themselves. And that includes textures as well. Okay, so we've got the legs set up. Now what I want to do is I want to be able to get some perhaps a little shading under the gun, just to kind of give the appearance that maybe there's some type of soft diffused shadowing underneath the gun, just to kind of give it the appearance that it really is sitting on the floor. Now I know we've got the ambient occlusion around the foot pads, and that's kind of helping, but I'd like to have just a little more. Before we actually do that though, you'll notice we've got this big circle, and that's because the ambient occlusion is actually picking up our HDR sphere that's sitting there for the reflection. So we need to go to the HDR sphere and go to its compositing tag and disable scene by AO. Now we can render again, and that circle is now gone. Okay, so let's talk about the different ways that we can perhaps maybe put some diffuse shadowing. Now, of course, we could go back and play around with the shadowing from the light dome. That's one way you can do it. Or you can introduce a single light into the scene and place it up above the gun, and you can either make it a shadow caster light, or you can just turn down the intensity of the light and give it some soft shadowing. So one thing we can do is to create a area light, and the area light we need to rotate down so the z-axis is pointing down. So we're just going to rotate that down in the p-value -90, and we're going to pull it up above the gun, and we'll extend this out about there. And we want to go into the General tab, take the brightness to 25, turn off specular. The shadow needs to be set to soft. And let's render this real quick and see what happens. Okay, nothing is happening, and the reason for that is because remember that we put the compositing tag on the floor and we turned off the receive shadow option. So let's go to the floor object, compositing tag, and click on receive shadow. Now it should receive some shadowing from that light, and you can see that it is. However, the problem now is that we're picking up all the other shadows from the light dome, and I kinda want to avoid that. So one way we can do this is click on the light that's a child of the cloner object, because this light is the one being cloned for the light dome, and we want to go to the scene tab, and here we have the inclusion and exclusion option. So make sure the mode is set to exclude, and we want to drag the floor object into this link box. And what this is basically doing here is we are excluding the floor from being affected by the light. And since that light is a child of the cloner object, then that means all of the lights being cloned for the light dome will not be able to affect the floor. It's being excluded. So we'll render now. And now those shadows are no longer there, but we are getting this very big, nasty black shadow. So in order to fix it, we need to go to the Shadow tab for the area light here. Go to the Shadow tab, and we want to take and play around with some of these settings. And the first thing we want to do is take the sample radius up to about 10, and the density, we want to try to pull the density down to maybe about 40%. Let's see what happens when we do that. Okay, there we go. Now that looks a lot better. Now we've got a nice diffused look here, and if you want to, you can actually pull the density down a little further. Okay, that looks pretty good right there, actually. So now we have our light here set up, and we've got a nice diffused look. So now it actually looks like it's sitting on the ground rather than floating. Okay, so let's begin with some texturing here. And I also need to take this light and disable it from the viewport. That way we can actually see what we're doing. And I'm going to select that light along with the target effector, and I'm just holding down Control to select multiple objects. I'm going to select the cloner and the sphere, and I'm going to hit Alt-G. That's going to group them, and I'm going to call this lights. Okay, so let's go back and continue working on the aluminum shader that we were using. So I would like to apply some ambient occlusion to this aluminum shader, and the reason for that is because if we take a look here on this cylinder, which is what we have that shader applied to, I would like to get a little more detail out of these corners. So in order to do that, we'll go and activate the diffusion channel, and we want to go to the drop down list and go to Effects Ambient Occlusion. So you'll notice that there are 3 settings here. One of them for Effect Specular is enabled. The other 2 are currently disabled. So what this means is that ambient occlusion will not be affecting any luminance type value or any reflection, which means that if we were to render a little region right here, you can see that ambient occlusion is not showing up on this shader even though we've activated it and we've turned on the diffusion channel. And the reason for that is because we need to enable the effect reflection. So as soon as we turn that on, and we'll come over here and do another little render region, now you can see that now we have dark shading in the corners and in the creases, giving us a lot better detail, and it just kind of helps to kind of bring out those corners and those creases and those extrusions. Now the only problem with this is that, seeing as how we are using reflection with the settings here, as well as of course the blurriness, as well as ambient occlusion in the diffusion channel, now this aluminum shader is just going to take that much longer to render. So a good rule of thumb is to go into your ambient occlusion and change some of these settings to kind of optimize them somewhat. Now you don't want to go too low with the samples or the accuracy, otherwise it's going to look very grainy and blotchy. So I usually find a setting of 75% for the accuracy, 7 for minimum samples, and 77 for maximum. Usually works pretty well. And we'll go back to the reflection, and we need to change the minimum and maximum samples here. Let's try 7 and 77 as well, and the accuracy we'll leave at 50. So I'll do a little preview here, and I just want to make sure that these settings are not going to look very blotchy. Okay, so you can see it still looks good. We've taken down the samples, and actually here for this reflection we could probably go down lower. So let's do 5 and 55. And we'll make another little preview here, and you can see it still looks the same, but we've actually optimized it a little bit by taking the sampling down. And what we could actually do here is take the brightness down a little bit as well. So I'll take it to about 35. Now if you want a more reflective look, you can keep it at 50 or go higher, but I think there's a little too much reflection in it. Okay, so now you can see we've reduced the amount of reflection there, and I think that looks pretty good. So we're going to hang on to this shader, and that works out pretty well. Okay, so we've set up our instancing for our legs, we've set up the lights for the light dome, we set up the light above it to kind of help give a shaded, diffused look underneath the gun. We've set up the compositing tags, and I think this probably is going to wrap up this part of this minigun series. And in the next part we'll throw some textures onto the gun, and then after that now we can actually start animating the gun and setting up the video wall that we're going to create. If any of you guys have any ideas of what you would like to see this minigun rip to shreds, then comment on this video and let me know what you might want to see, and we'll just take it from there.